Diffusion. In this lesson, we will look at the science and engineering practices of developing and using models, constructing explanations and designing solutions, engaging in argument from evidence, and obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information. Our cross-cutting concepts include cause and effect, scale, proportion, and quantity, systems and system models, as well as structure and function. Diffusion. Why can the student smell the pizza from a distance? The pizza can be smelled because molecules are moving away from it and spreading out in the air. This process is called diffusion. Where's the smell the strongest? Smell's obviously the strongest near the pizza, and it gets weaker the further away you are from pizza. This is because the concentration of molecules from the pizza is highest in the air closest to it. Diffusion is the movement of very small particles into and out of cells. To move in and out of cells, particles need to cross the cell's membrane. The cell membrane allows some particles, such as water and food, to diffuse easily across it. Although particles can move both in and out of a cell, the overall movement of particles is often uneven. The overall movement of particles is called net movement. So what happens to molecules during diffusion? If we have a whole bunch of particles over here, 20 of them, and 0 over here, those particles are going to diffuse. And they are going to continue to diffuse back and forth. Notice that we're relatively equal. We're jumping back and forth between 12 and 7 and 10 and 10. But ultimately, these particles are slowing down over time. The direction of diffusion. Materials move into and out of cells across the cell membrane. The net movement of particles is from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So if we have high concentration over here and low concentration over here, those particles on the high concentration side want to diffuse over to low concentration. This movement will continue until the particles become evenly spread out in the two areas. Which way will the majority of oxygen particles move? Notice that oxygen is represented by the blue circles. We have a high concentration of oxygen on the left and a low concentration on the right. In this example, the net movement of oxygen particles will be from left to right. This is from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So where do you think high concentrations of oxygen are found in the body? Let's summarize. Are these statements about diffusion true or false? Diffusion is the movement of very small particles into and out of cells. That's true. The net movement of particles will be from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration. That's false. It's the other way, high concentration to low concentration. Diffusion helps particles to spread out evenly. This is true. And the overall movement of particles is always even. That is false. Diffusion in the body. Diffusion is the main way materials move in and out of cells. So which materials do we need to move within the body? Oxygen, carbon dioxide, food, and waste products are some of the materials that move into and out of cells by diffusion. These substances are transported around the body in the bloodstream. From there, they can then diffuse into and out of cells. Breathing involves the movement of gases into and out of the body by diffusion. What happens when you breathe? Oxygen is inhaled, and that air diffuses through the lungs and into the bloodstream. The oxygen is then transported throughout the body. Carbon dioxide is a waste product that is produced by cells. Carbon dioxide diffuses from body tissues into the bloodstream and is exhaled by the lungs. When you breathe in, air moves into tiny air sacs in the lungs, and gases diffuse from the bloodstream into these air sacs. The blue-colored cell represents blood without oxygen, and so they are most likely releasing CO2. The redder-colored cells represent cells that have oxygen that has diffused from the air sac in our lungs into the blood cell, and then it can move throughout the body to supply oxygen to the cells everywhere in our body. So oxygen moves into the blood from the air sacs, and carbon dioxide moves from the blood into the air sacs. Diffusion in the digestive system. Carbohydrates, proteins, and fats in food are made up of large molecules that cannot easily diffuse into cells. Digestion breaks down large food molecules into smaller molecules such as glucose that can be easily absorbed. These food molecules are absorbed into the body by diffusion in the small intestine. What about diffusion in plants? Gases diffuse into and out of a plant through its leaves. Plants need carbon dioxide, and there's a higher concentration of carbon dioxide outside of the plant than inside. Therefore, carbon dioxide moves into the leaf by diffusion. Plants produce oxygen. There's a higher concentration of oxygen inside the plant than outside. Therefore, oxygen moves out of the leaf by diffusion. The diffusion rate of molecules can vary. So what is meant by diffusion rate? Diffusion rate is the speed at which molecules move across a cell membrane. A fast diffusion rate means that the net movement of molecules occurs quickly. And a slow diffusion rate means that the net movement of molecules occurs very slowly. Factors affecting diffusion rates. The diffusion rate can depend on several factors, including thickness of the cell membrane, size or the surface area of the cell, and difference in particle concentration inside and outside of the cell. So let's look at surface area. The surface area of a cell is the total area of its outer surface. So here's cell A and cell B. Which cell has a larger surface area? Notice that this cell has a pretty defined shape, whereas this cell seems to have some divots and bends and twists to the outside of the cell. Cell A has a larger surface area because of the fact that it moves and twists with the membrane. The folds in the membrane result in a larger outside surface. The effect of surface area on diffusion. How does surface area affect diffusion? The larger the surface area, the faster the diffusion rate, because there's more space where materials are in contact with the membrane. The smaller the surface area, the slower the diffusion rate. Why is this? The larger the surface area of the cell, the more cell membrane there is for the molecules to diffuse across. So let's look at an animation to help understand this. How does the surface area affect the diffusion rate? Do you know how the surface area of a cell affects the rate of diffusion? Over this large surface area, molecules have many opportunities to diffuse across the membrane. The diffusion rate is high. Over this smaller surface area, molecules have fewer opportunities to diffuse across the membrane. Therefore, the diffusion rate is low. Cell membrane thickness. The thickness of a cell membrane affects the rate of diffusion into and out of the cell as well. Molecules take longer to move across the thick membrane. The thicker the cell membrane, the slower the rate of diffusion. Molecules take less time to move across a thin membrane. The thinner the cell membrane, the quicker the rate of diffusion. So how does cell membrane thickness affect diffusion? Do you know how the thickness of a cell membrane affects the rate of diffusion? Let's start with a thick membrane. Molecules take less time to move through a thin membrane, therefore the rate of diffusion is quicker. Let's switch over to a thick membrane. Molecules take longer to move through a thick membrane. Therefore, the rate of diffusion is slower. Particle concentration. The difference in concentration of particles on either side of a cell membrane affects the rate of diffusion. So which diagram shows a bigger difference in concentration? Look at the number of molecules inside and outside of each cell. So which example is likely to have the fastest diffusion rate? The net movement of molecules will be faster when there is a bigger difference in concentration. Notice there are far more particles outside than inside this cell. The rate of diffusion will be greater here as particles rush in. So the faster rate of diffusion will occur in diagram B. Diffusion in the small intestine. How does diffusion occur in our small intestine? Small food molecules are usually absorbed in the small intestine. Diffusion across the intestine wall and into the bloodstream. The wall of the small intestine is lined with many tiny finger-like projections called villi. These are very thin and increase the surface area of the small intestine, which increases the speed of diffusion. So how does the initial concentration of dissolved food molecules in the small intestine compare with the concentration in the blood, in the villi? The concentration of dissolved food molecules is higher in the small intestine than in the blood entering the villus. This means that the dissolved food molecules diffuse from the small intestine into the blood, moving from higher to lower concentration. I hope this was helpful in explaining diffusion and how materials move into and out of our cells.